Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for the applause. That was fun. You all know that, most unfortunately, the DA is not here tonight. He had a conflict that really stopped him from coming. But the good news, it's a little bit of good news, is it gives us all more time to talk. Because the more panelists you have, the less you can talk. So I am going to summarize the Floyd case. And I'm a little intimidated tonight because the lead counsel in that case is here. He didn't tell me he was coming, so he's going to wave your hand, Jonathan. Jonathan Moore was the lead counsel in Floyd versus City of New York. So he could actually step out because he's heard all this before, but I think it's important that you all hear it just to set the stage of what we have to do tonight. So the history of stop and frisk in New York, as practiced by the NYPD, clearly shows the disparate impact of a law enforcement tactic that wasn't particularly effective and that deeply alienated communities of color. How do I know that it was basically ineffective? Because when it was stopped, the headline said, the city will blow up and crime will go up and it's all over, we're going to burn. And that is exactly not what happened. Crime, in fact, did not go up. If anything, it went down. So that was very vindicating after that decision, because God forbid it went up, they would have said that judge, destroyed the city. But it didn't happen. Crime did not go up. It was level, and then it dropped and dropped and dropped for a while. So there you have it. It wasn't effective. So let me give you some facts that came out during the trial. First of all, there were 4.4 million Terry stops between 2004 and 2012. Just think about that. We're talking about the city, not the state. 4.4 million stops. And just to show you the rise, it was 314,000 in 2004, but 686,000 in 2011, and then it began to tail off. 52% of those stopped were Black, 31% were Hispanic, only 10% were white. In 2010, New York's population was 23% Black. So I don't have a slide, but population 23%, but stopped 52%. Whites were 33%, but only 10% of the stops. Now, if you're really neutral and not racist, you will realize that for most of the low-level crimes for those stops, they're committed every bit as much by white folks as Black folks. It just depends where you look for them. So this all showed that Blacks were overstopped and whites were understopped because the officers focused on certain communities where they expected to find people committing minor crimes, or crimes. Now, this was true in other large cities. In Chicago, Blacks made up 32% of the population, but accounted for 72% of stops. In Boston, Blacks made up 24% of the population, but accounted for 64% of stops. Yeah, I hope you got that, 24, 64. And in Philadelphia, Blacks made up 43% of the population, but 72% of stops. So this was nationwide. This wasn't just New York City. Well, back to New York. 52% of all stops were followed by a frisk. But you know what? The frisks were just invasive of people's rights. What was found? Nothing, except in 1.5% of the frisks, which is a tiny yield, 1.5%. All those people were frisked for nothing, 300,000 people. Force was used in 23% of the stops of Blacks, but only 17% of the stops of whites. So those numbers sound similar, but they're really not. It's almost half as much again. And we are all painfully aware, are we not, of the tragic consequences that often occur when that force is used. And a frisk is force. And once you start that frisk, you've seen what happens. People get out of the car, they're frisked, and somehow things escalate and somebody dies. Blacks were 30% more likely to be arrested than whites following the stop for the very same suspected crime. At the same time, charges were 8% less likely to be brought against a Black person who was stopped than against a white person, which is interesting because it shows that the stops of Blacks lacked objective, reasonable suspicion more often than the stops of white. After all, if the suspicion had made any sense, they might have been arrested. In 88% of the stops, there was no further law enforcement action at all, which again shows that there was likely no objective reasonable suspicion for the stop in the first place. Just an invasive stop, and then you go on your way. And you know, for those of us who haven't been stopped, which is likely the paler folks in the room, we can't imagine what it is to be thrown up against a wall, even for just 2 minutes, patted down, intrusive, and then said, go on your way. And I certainly can't imagine what it's like when you're 10 years old, or 12 years old, or 14 years old. So it's hard to put ourselves in those shoes, but it's a terrible, terrible intrusion. So how did this disparity come about, all these statistics that I just told you? The NYPD pressured line officers to increase the number of stops, believing this to be this effective tool for preventing crimes. Precinct commanders told the officers, and this is a quote from the trial, stop the right people at the right time in the right place. This translates to racially biased policing. Furthermore, the accepted basis for making stops were things like furtive movements or high crime area. Well, furtive movements is in the eye of the beholder. What could be more subjective than furtive movements? And what does high crime area mean? It means communities of color where, unfortunately, there was a crime. But there's crime everywhere, and they didn't focus there. And these were the reasons given on the stop forms. And of course, because it's so subjective, it ended up being racially biased policing. Finally, there was evidence at the trial of surreptitious recordings made at roll calls at various precincts. And I'll give you just 2 examples. One lieutenant said, and I quote, "You're not working in Midtown Manhattan where people are walking around smiling and happy. You're working in Bed-Stuy where everyone's probably got a warrant." Another lieutenant in Brooklyn said, "Keep the corner clear. If the crowd is too big, they're going to think they own the block. But we own the block, not them. They might live here, but we own the block. We own the streets. You tell them what to do. Just stop them. You can always come up with a reason for the stop afterward." Finally, and this says it all, one of the highest-ranking uniformed officers testified at the trial that, quote, "Stops are based on who is committing crimes. Well, it's young men of color in their late teens, early 20s. The problem is male blacks, 14 to 21. And so that was the culture. The police commissioner acknowledged, we are told it, he didn't testify, but we were told he said, quote, "We want to instill fear in young blacks and Hispanics that every time they leave their home, they could be stopped by the police." So that is a quick overview of what stop and frisk was and how it led to disproportionate law enforcement action against people of color in this community and many others in the United States.
Judge Scheindlin, thank you so much for that breakdown and just also a lot of the highlights that those that may not have followed Floyd or who don't work with it regularly can just have a better understanding of how Your Honor came to that decision and where we stand now in 2023. Jarrett, I want to turn a little bit to you because your story from a personal standpoint is one that I can't even put into words and that I hate. In terms of that ever having happened to you and just having discussed before we even began the conversation, just what is going on with respect to exonerees and when you hear what Judge Scheindlin ultimately just discussed, how did that play in maybe a little bit to your story and just let you take it from there?
I'll stand up like Judge did, but do not expect these numbers in that preparation. That's exactly what it is. But as I sat now, I'm listening to Judge. First, I was very familiar with the case. Never had met the attorney before. Didn't know that was him. Salute to you and the work that you put in. But I may sound like Mr. Rogers tonight, but the real thing that we have to do is start caring about one another. Regardless of how we look, where we come from, we really just need to get back to the basics of caring for one another, because when you have sympathy and empathy for someone, it's hard for you to just ignore, when things are happening that isn't right. So for me, I'll do a elevator pitch of my story. Many people in here probably have never heard of me before. I'm 17 years old, born and raised on the south side of Chicago, just my mom, my aunts, my grandmother. I don't have a story of being in the streets with gangs and all of that because my grandmother didn't play no games, all right? She was about 4'9". She came from down south, Jackson, Mississippi, along with my grandfather, and they snuck their kids from slavery that, although it wasn't there in name, still existed with folks working in those fields. One by one, they got them up to Chicago on the west side, and then ended up on the south side. So I was the youngest of about 16 grandkids. I was the last one. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother and my grandfather. So they instilled a whole lot into me and kept me away from the streets. This is when Chicago was really turning bad from the introduction of crack cocaine with the help of our government inside of these communities of color. So it was a lot of shock and dismay to my family when I took a trip to a college party along with a couple friends, and I was falsely accused of a sexual assault. I ended up being sentenced to serve 28 years in prison based on nothing but an accusation. It took the help of the Wisconsin Innocence Project and me writing letters and drafts of my own habeas, and in 10 years, they argued in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and they unanimously reversed my conviction because the police withheld a statement that corroborated what me and my friends were saying from the very beginning. I came home in February of 2007, and I was 26, turning 27 years old, and I started where I left off. I went to junior college. I ended up going to a four-year college, graduated from Loyola Law School in Chicago. I clerked for the same Seventh Circuit that overturned my conviction, and I finished up that clerkship in the Southern District of New York with the late, great Judge Deborah Batts. Now, I say all of this not to impress you, but to impress upon you what we're throwing away. Because no one looked at me to have this type of potential when I was sitting in that courtroom. I was referred to as the young black man from Chicago so many times, hell, I thought that was my name by the end of the trial. So when I came home, I wanted my lick back. I'm not sure if y'all know what that terminology means. I'm from Chicago, right? And what we call when somebody hits you the wrong way, you get your lick back, right? I wanted my mother to get her seat back in the front row and passing out peppermints, the same memories I had of her before I was falsely accused of this heinous act. The first stop was mental health care before I went to this law school, this college, and all of that type of stuff. And along the way, I've documented as much as I possibly can on what it's like to be the defendant, and now I am the defender. My firm does mostly civil work. We do 1983. We do about 75% 1983 civil work in order to be able to pay for indigent work for actually innocent men and women. And the women seem like they are increasing more in numbers than the men. I just want to say again before I close again, what I found is that the sympathy and empathy is missing. And I'll give you a perfect example. I'm in law school. I actually went to law school with Jade. I did a summer program in London because I wanted to graduate on time with everybody else because I was a part-time student working full-time because my mother or none of us could get these loans and stuff like that to go to school. Part of our assignment going to this London program was to go to the Old Bailey, which is their courthouse, and view people and write a report on what we would translate from that legal system to our legal system in America. So I went, and I'm standing up at the top because you're in the bleachers, you're looking down, and all the lawyers and all of the witnesses are down in sort of a pit. And I saw the most amazing, thorough attorney that I had ever saw in my early years in law school. And it was a lady. And she was prosecuting a sexual child case. She was prepared, she was ready, she had binders, she knew where everything was, and she was really aggressive, but she was polite. And she was really making her point. We had to come back to the Old Bailey again the next week. And when I came back, she was the same aggressive, polite, prepared attorney, but this time she was defending a sexual assault case. And that is what I meant when I said, if we can find a way to bring back the sympathy and empathy in us, then it's hard for us to watch injustices happen and just sit back as if they're not happening. Thank you, guys.
Very, very well put. Which, now, Kirk, I want to turn to you just with respect to the 20 years, of course, that you had on the force. When you think about reform and law enforcement and the story that you just heard from Jarrett and Judge Scheindlin's breakdown, of course, of Floyd, which, came, of course, when you were on the force. Talk to me a little bit just about your perspective in all of this.
So, Adam and I were talking about this. As a matter of fact, Adam asked me the question, how has my perspective changed? So, my career, well, first of all, full disclosure, my father was a sergeant in the New York City Police Department. He joined in 1962. And we actually worked in the same precinct, about 15 years apart, in the 3-2 precinct in Harlem. And so, I was very fortunate in that respect because I had a mentor and I had someone to kind of set me straight. So I remember, and this is very true, I know it sounds a little corny, but, in my day that my father drove me to get sworn in, he told me two things. One, this is the last ride you'll ever get to work. And, and then the second thing he told me was no matter who you encounter, whether it's someone who's a victim, someone who needs help, or someone who you have to arrest for a crime, treat them as if they were your mother. And if you do that, you'll never go wrong. And those words really resonated with me because I never heard him really use my mother as a reference for how to treat others out in the world. So, at that time, I was 21 years old when I was sworn in. So it was quite impressionable, and it made an impression on me. So, during that time, the time that I was a police officer, I saw a lot of the history that we saw with regards to law enforcement between 1984 and 2004, between the so-called war on drugs, the so-called war on traditional organized crime, and the so-called war on terror. So I rode all these major waves between the units that I worked in, between patrol and the narcotics division, and the Organized Crime Control Bureau and the Intelligence Division, culminating my career with a focus on counterterrorism. So it's just really interesting. I went to law school during my last 4 years as a police officer. And yes, these disparities are real. I always like to say that, unfortunately, people of color, and in particular Black people, are the low-hanging fruit of law enforcement. We can dig into a little bit further as we move forward, but one would believe that only folks who make $100,000 a year or less commit crimes. Everyone else, no one else commits a crime, and only folks who live in public housing, and only folks, those are the only folks who commit crime, because that's the focus of law enforcement. Folks who live in public housing, communities of color, poorer communities, and just those who are on the street. So it's quite unfortunate. And when the judge spoke about numbers, and I recall, every time I wanted a day off or wanted a change of assignment, the first thing, a commanding officer would do is pull out your activity and see how many stop and frisk forms, they're called US 250s you had, how many arrests you made, and so forth. And that was the measure of your effectiveness as a police officer, right? So the measure of your effectiveness was not how you assisted those in the community necessarily. It was a very numbers-driven profession. So, Black folks, but this is nothing new because Black folks have been the low-hanging fruit of law enforcement since the 13th Amendment, and it continues on today. And this is a cycle that starts with law enforcement, and it just carries through incarceration, or as I like to call it, the recapture of African Americans in our society, because basically that's what we are seeing. When we think about the numbers of folks and the disparity between folks who are stopped and arrested and incarcerated, well, what I'm saying about recapture doesn't seem like much of a stretch. So I've certainly seen a lot. I'm a little hopeful in this day and age. We'll once again, we mentioned it, but maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we wouldn't even be having this discussion in the New York City bar, but we are today. And so there is some progress, but we do have a way to go, and this disparity still exists. All you have to do is turn on CNN or MSNBC you know, once a week or once every couple of weeks, and you see some Black person being abused or murdered by law enforcement. So I hope that answers your question.
Very well. Very, very well. And it also kind of organically takes me to you, Adam, with a lot of the work that you do on behalf of incarcerated persons, particularly over the years, your expertise that has been given to just the realm and concept of mass incarceration, right? When we talk about law enforcement reform, you know, clearly we think over the course of the last 2 to 3 years, and even the last 2 to 3 weeks, when we talk about bail reform, when we talk about just a lot of these issues that underlie this supposed connection between jail, cages, and incarceration, and somehow or another betterment for society, right? Talk me through, when we think about and talk about reform in the context of the work that you do, how you approach it.
Well, I think we need to sort of start by identifying what the problem is. And before I do, I just want to acknowledge 2 former clients and now friends who are with me tonight and who may well be up here. Dexter Murray, the handsome gentleman wearing the appropriately Fight the Power shirt in the back, and James Thompson wearing the Yankees cap right there. Both of them have sort of informed and shaped my opinion and perspective on so much of this. And I think a lot about the report that came out in 2020. The New York Court of Appeals appointed a special advisor to review racial bias in the New York State court system. And after conducting a thorough investigation, the special advisor concluded that there is a second-class system of justice for people of color in New York State. Those conclusions, those findings, echo a report of the same kind from 1991, despite all of the efforts at reform since then. Listen to how similar this is. There are 2 justice systems at work in the courts of New York State, one for whites and a very different one for minorities. And both reports corroborate what incarcerated people and advocates for incarcerated people well know, that there is no part of the criminal legal system far beyond policing that is not defined by staggering racial disparate outcomes. Whether you're looking at bail, as you said, whether you're looking at jury selection, whether you're looking at sentencing, whether you're looking at parole, whether you're looking at parole revocation, all of those things. And I think, you know, we could talk about the historical and narrative reasons for it, which I think we'll get to a little bit later in the program. But because we're at the city bar, I just want to take a moment to talk about a Supreme Court case called McCleskey versus Kemp. It's from 1987 that I think remains sort of largely outside the public view, even among lawyers. It's a LDF case and challenging the constitutionality of the death penalty. And in McCleskey, Warren McCleskey, who is a Black man on death row in Georgia, presented evidence demonstrating that race, particularly the race of the victim, was the single most predictive factor in determining who lived and who died. That the correlation between race and the death penalty was 3 times the correlation between smoking and lung disease. When confronted with that evidence, the Supreme Court actually accepted the validity of the statistics. They didn't try to create a factual dispute, but they said, we need to reject your equal protection challenge as a matter of law for 2 reasons. The first thing the court says is that if we strike down the death penalty because of racial disparities, it's only a matter of time before we have to strike down the entire criminal legal system because there's no part of the legal system that isn't defined by similar disparities. In dissent, the late Justice William Brennan said that the court today demonstrates a fear of too much justice, and he was absolutely right about that. The second thing that the court said is extraordinary and, in my view, incredibly disheartening. The court said, and I quote, "Racial discrimination in the administration of the death penalty is inevitable." Inevitable. And so what does it mean that the highest court in the land, with equal justice under the law engraved in the ensign, says that when it comes to the ultimate punishment, racial discrimination is inevitable? It means we have a court that would not only rather have a racist death penalty than no death penalty at all, but a court that is willing to tolerate disparities at every single part of the system, and in so tolerating, created a standard where, barring an audible racial epithet in a particular case, it is almost impossible to meaningfully root out racial bias in the criminal adjudication process. Warren McCleskey was executed in 1991, and contemporary observers have described McCleskey versus Kemp as the Dred Scott of the 21st century. It is an important reason why we continue to have these disparities today, which of course undermine the reliability, the credibility, and the integrity of the criminal legal system, is antithetical to public safety, and of course cannot be reconciled with the basic principle that people should be punished for what they do, not who they are.
Thank you. Oh, let's, thank you, Adam. You know, it's like we've had conversations leading up to this event, and still in the event can be left speechless. So, let me ask you all this: why? Why has the movement, and I'm thinking about something you just said, Kirk, when we were talking about just the origins of policing dating back to the 13th Amendment, as you've both discussed. We will discuss it a little bit further, but with all of the issues clearly that we've had with policing in communities of color, particularly the Black community, since the ratification of the 13th Amendment, why has the movement to reform U.S. law enforcement just recently, or at least seemingly, gained traction and international attention, most notably following the murder of George Floyd and the 2020 summer of racial reckoning? And look, everyone, I'm just going to remind you all to please silence your phones. Just take a couple seconds right now. Just silence your phones, and then we can pick the conversation back up. Everybody good? All right. Let me start, if you caught the end of that question, Jarrett.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with you, and I'd love to kind of have a little back and forth. I'm thinking maybe between you and Kirk, and then let's see where the conversation goes.
Yeah. So I think that it was timing. I think what happened was the pandemic was going on. So even people who are extremely busy, barely watch TV, were watching TV during that time. And I think that when it goes back to that sympathy and empathy thing that I'm saying, everyone has a mama. And when you heard that man screaming for his mama as his life was slipping from him, I don't know anyone who couldn't understand that type of pain. But it was short-lived, because not many people know or understand that that George Floyd bill still has not passed at all. So for the moment, there were changes, there were officers going to jail, but there wasn't systematic change. And when you think about the officers going to jail, I want you to think about having bad plumbing, and all you keep doing is changing the faucet. Faucet could be beautiful, amazing, but you're gonna still have the same bad plumbing issues. I use a lot of analogies, y'all, because we do a lot of cases in the Northern District, very few Black people, so I have to relate to the jurors I have by using analogies, so forgive me, all right? But I seriously mean that in terms of, I have a best friend who's been a police officer ever since leaving the Air Force. So I'm talking from a perspective of listening to him, having conversations with him about how he wears a White Sox jersey when he leaves work. And I asked him why. He like, man, look, people be doing stuff to police. I never thought about that, right? Until I had a conversation with him. I think that when you think about everyone looking at George Floyd, everyone wanted to immediately fix what was before their eyes. As soon as we came back outside, everything else took and shifted away. So I think that what we have to do is find a way how to have our surfboards ready when that wave of justice comes, because that tide don't stay high for long.
Well, I guess just to pick up, and then Kirk, as I noted, I want you to kind of jump in on this, right? But thinking about over the course of my lifetime, right, when we talk about how we all had to sit back and unfortunately watch a man die for 9 minutes in front of us, I do nevertheless remember, when I was in third grade, watching Los Angeles burn almost to the ground, right? And hearing the stories, having been born and raised in Detroit, of 1967 and a lot of the issues that, led to what still makes that city one of the most segregated cities in the nation, because, again, of just police conflict and violence within the Black community. We can take this all the way back to the Scottsboro boys. I mean, clearly, there have been issues that we have had, issues that within the 90s and the 2000s made their way onto either camcorders or cell phone video. So it's not the first time we've seen it. That's what I'm trying to say, right? And we've been through these things. We've been through the riots. We've been through something's got to change. Talk to me about what's so different now and why now.
I think Jarrett hit the nail on the head. You know, first and foremost, the pandemic. You know, what were we all doing in 2020? We were sitting on our couch, eating and watching television in an endless loop. So that's number one. Also, you know, these types of incidents have always gained some form of attention. You mentioned Rodney King, and I was a police officer at the time, a detective at the time, and I remember that incident. However, now we have this 24-hour news cycle and YouTube and Twitter and so forth. And folks can watch these videos endlessly. And then, Jared, you touched on the fact that he was calling out for his mother. I mean, this was a particularly heinous act, and the lack of empathy that the police officer showed while this man was crying out for himself. So it was a perfect storm of horrendous events where folks had no choice but to focus and cry out. And you have to give some credit also to the Black community. I mean, folks were not going to stand still and take it. And I remember, you know, my daughter, she's 30, she called me up. I had her when I was 4. So she called me, she called me up, and on the way to protest, you know, she was in DC. And every single day, you know, the most I could do was just say, hey, do me a favor, call me when you're on the way and call me when you get home. And she's never been the type of person to take to the streets. So people were incredibly moved by this vicious nature. Yeah, there are a lot of issues, and there still are, with that particular police department. I think it's one of the first times, however, we saw the chief of a police department come out and testify and speak out against one of his officers. So these things are not perfect, but it was a perfect storm of events. But it's certainly not a perfect solution, because lo and behold, what has happened since then? Well, we've seen many more deaths, murders, assaults, and so forth. So there is a tension. As I said, we're moving forward, and it was somewhat of a watershed moment, but it was a watershed moment for the beginning of the ball moving forward, as opposed to actual substantive change. I mean, Rodney King, that took place, 92, I believe, 93? Yeah. Are we going to have that same conversation 30 years from now, 40 years from now, wondering why the death of George Floyd didn't correct this? And I do have thoughts as to what will be necessary for this to be corrected, but I'll save that until we circle back around.
Can I just add 1 or 2 comments?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think what was so different here was the new video by citizens in these cases. Once you can stop having the police control the narrative, in so many of these older cases, we get out front and they control the narrative and tell their side of what happened, and there is no other side. Here, the narrative immediately was in the video, and it was an intentional, premeditated murder that everybody saw. So it was a heinous crime for a very minor stop situation. This was counterfeit bills. It was like our Eric Garner loose cigarette case. I mean, the most minor thing. So there was no, you know, what was the phrase, good folks on both sides. Forget that. This was just so weighted in one direction. And I think that's what really caused people to react all over the country, there and everywhere else. So I just wanted to add those few comments.
No, thank you for adding those comments, because I mean, it does ultimately make a lot of sense. And as you talk about moving past 2020, I would really hate in 20 years the way that maybe we do look back at like Rodney King, is that's just something that happened. If 20 years from now we're looking back at George Floyd, that's just something that happened. Again, that's why we're here tonight having this conversation, because that can't happen. Let's go ahead and move on to actually part 2 of our conversation, because we've had a lot of discussion this evening. Even if not explicitly, we've implicitly talked about a lot of the just disparities in law enforcement, right? And particularly in policing. I mean, Judge Scheindlin gave ultimately a lot of those numbers in regards to, you know, what stop and frisk with those 4.4 million stops, and the percentages in terms of what was actually found and who it was actually not found on, right? Where do a lot of these racial disparities in law enforcement in this country come from? Adam, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So I think so much of this is a narrative problem. And I think we can't understand the origins of the narrative without sort of talking about our history. And I think it requires us to go all the way back to our country's founding and acknowledge the fact that we live in a post-genocide society, that white settlers killed millions of native people through disease, through war, through famine, and justified that brutality by telling stories about them. We said they were dangerous, less intelligent, less human. And those same narratives were used to justify 2.5 centuries of enslavement. You could not think of yourself as a just person. You could not think of yourself as a person of faith and enslave other human beings without creating dehumanizing narratives about them. And so as my former Boston professor, Mr. Brian Stevenson has said, the great evil of American slavery was not involuntary servitude. It was the narratives of racial difference. It was the ideology of white supremacy and black inferiority that emerged. And when the 13th Amendment was passed and abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime, it did nothing to address those narratives. And so as my former colleagues at the Equal Justice Initiative have argued, slavery didn't end in 1865, it evolved. It evolved into decades of black codes, of convict leasing, of racial terrorism. Between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in 1950, researchers have documented that white people lynched nearly 7,000 black people, which is almost certainly an undercount. And unlike what is typically depicted, those lynchings were usually not perpetrated by someone wearing a hood under the cover of darkness, but rather by prominent members of the community, by doctors, by lawyers, by judges, often with the help and complicity of law enforcement in broad daylight. And to justify those acts of racial terrorism, white community members doubled down on the same narratives that were used to justify enslavement and augmented them with narratives that completely linked blackness with criminality, with guilt, and with dangerousness. And these were not only acts of interpersonal violence, but rather a message to the entire community saying, if you do anything to challenge the racial hierarchy, this is what could happen to you. As a result of this terrorism, 6 million black people fled the South to cities in the North and Midwest, like New York, like Chicago, like Cleveland, like Detroit, not only looking for new economic opportunity, but as refugees from racial terrorism. And when they arrived in these cities, they were confronted with additional violence. In the Civil Rights Congress wrote in a petition to the United Nations in 1951 that the classic method of lynching used to be the rope, and now it is the policeman's bullet. And this was not a history I ever learned, even attending very well-meaning New York City public schools. I learned about Abraham Lincoln, and I learned what Mr. Stevenson has referred to a very sort of celebratory version of the civil rights movement, like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. On day 3, Lyndon Johnson signed a bunch of laws, and racism was over. We didn't talk about the fact that law enforcement bloodied people just marching for equality. We didn't talk about the fact that to be law enforcement meant enforcing segregationist statutes. That's what it meant to enforce the law. We didn't talk about the way that bail was used to disrupt social movements. We didn't talk about the way that the criminal legal system was used as an act of resistance. And so even as this wonderful civil rights legislation of the 1960s was being passed, the foundation for mass incarceration was being laid. And those resistance to civil rights ended up evolving into a racialized war on drugs, overcharging by prosecutors, mandatory minimum sentences, punitive parole boards, revocation for technical offenses like curfew, all under these presumptions of guilt and dangerousness, these narratives that began in the era of enslavement. And this is not a Southern problem. This is not a regional problem. This is an American problem. We have Rikers Island in our backyard. A lot of people don't realize that Rikers Island bears the name of Richard Riker, who earlier in his life enslaved black people and later in his life adjudicated Fugitive Slave Act claims. When I was an appellate public defender in New York, I did not have a single white client. And I'm reminded of the case of my dear friend, Mr. Murray, who spent 31 months on Rikers Island for a crime he did not commit. And once he left the island that bore the name of a proponent of slavery, the white prosecutor in this case, and this is just in Manhattan, excluded every single prospective juror through peremptory strikes with the exception of one. And I'm also reminded of my dear friend James's case, who spent nearly a decade in prison for possessing the amount of drugs that someone on a college campus do all the time, and was sentenced under the Rockefeller drug laws. And so when I think about James, when I think about Mr. Murray, and I think about the title of this panel, it's not these people who need to be redeemed, it's not these people who need to be rehabilitated, but rather it is the system that is in desperate need of redemption.
Jarrett, Adams coming to the barbecue, all right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're both from the Midwest. You know what that means.
Look.
Adams coming to the barbecue. I don't know.
Already got a bottle of hot sauce with his name on it,
Yes.
man. Like, my God, like for real, all facts.
Okay. I'm sorry, Judge Scheindlin.
I think our plan was for me to add more specifics of the history of all of this in our country. I know you covered it in your own way, and I want to cover it a little bit too. So I'm going to do it chronologically and tell you about our country's history. Some of it you know and some of it you don't, but the point is I want to focus on law enforcement's role at each of these steps. So the history starts with slave patrols. That's a kind of law enforcement. They stopped, harassed, whipped, injured, or killed black slaves in order to monitor and suppress slave rebellions in the South. That's step one. In the North, at the same time, many police officers were immigrants themselves, and they used their law enforcement jobs to control a non-white labor force who they feared. They feared they would work cheaper than the recent immigrants. And then we turn to something called debt peonage, which is really another form of slavery. And I want to recommend a book here. I always like to recommend books when I talk, and it's called Slavery by Another Name.
Yeah, it's a good book.
Great book by Douglas Blackman. And he tells the story. Blacks were arrested for non-existent offenses, like speaking rudely to a white woman. Think of Emmett Till and what happened to Emmett Till. Walking in a certain way, spitting on the sidewalk, disturbing the peace, which basically means being noisy, or vagrancy, which means being unemployed. They were then convicted. So they're arrested by law enforcement. They're then convicted by judges and sentenced to crimes and fines for those crimes that they couldn't pay. So then the white businessmen paid the fines and then forced the defendant to sign a contract to repay the debt. And these contracts were often signed by illiterate people with an X, and they worked for years as forced laborers to pay off the debt for these non-crimes. And law enforcement was the key to that system, from the arrest through the charge through the sentence. In more modern times, just look at the report prepared by the Department of Justice after Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, Missouri. What we learned from the DOJ report is that some crimes were almost exclusively charged against blacks. 95% of all crimes called manner of walking in roadway were charged only against black people. 94% of charges for failure to comply with an order of a law enforcement officer were only for black people. Many of these people were then jailed for being unable to pay the fines and fees that were imposed for those offenses. And then, because the local municipal court was operated as a part of the police department, the department was funded by those very fines, the brunt of which was borne by African Americans. And then you've touched on it, what is called extrajudicial punishment, better known as lynchings, and you gave us the statistics, and it's worth repeating. Between 1877 and 1950, they were just shy of 4,000 lynchings in 12 southern states. But here's the law enforcement element. Rather than protecting the victims when those lynchings were happening, law enforcement either stood by or actually participated in the lynching conduct. And again, to quote Brian Stevenson, he said, lynching didn't change, it just moved indoors. You've heard that famous phrase. Instead of outdoors, you have executions disproportionately, which you mentioned. And just one more comment on the war of drugs. You touched on that too. It began in 1914, so that war is over 100 years old, with the Harrison Act that criminalized the possession, use, and sale of narcotics. Actually, it was mostly marijuana. The first head of the FBI, this is a true story, said that marijuana had a disproportionate effect on Black people. It made them forget the appropriate racial barriers, and it unleashed their lust for white women. That is a quote. Another great book that I recommend is called Chasing the Scream. If anybody wants to write these things down, Chasing the Scream by Johan Hari, really great book, who wrote that the main reason for banning drugs was the belief at that time that people of color were, quote, forgetting their place and menacing white people when they used drugs. So that's the history. That's really, I see you shaking your head there. That is the history of how the big war on drugs came to be.
Yeah, that's deep. I mean, that truly is. Because I forgot who said it earlier, but that most certainly was not in detail in my teachings in the Chicago public school system.
Jarrett, let me just break in real quick.
Yeah.
Just because, of course, as we get to the end of this, I know that there's going to be questions. There have been index cards that have been provided to all. So to the extent, if you have not yet submitted said index card with your question, please hold it up so that we can make sure to be able to pick that up. And when we get to the Q&A session, we'll be set. So thank you, Jarrett. I didn't mean to cut into you. I'll let you finish this, and then we're going to get into how we can actually start to eradicate these racial disparities. But go ahead.
I mean, this is deep. I've learned a couple different things tonight. Like, number one, the Rikers Island. That was pretty deep. But then as well, just the history. I'm not too sure why we're afraid of dealing with our history. It's not indicative of who we are right now as people. It only helps us to not make the same mistakes. Florida's trying to do away with all of that, right? And I think that the one thing that I do want to say, I had this on my mind when I was listening to Judge and the numbers. I think one of the solutions is we have to find a way as minorities in different groups, whether you're a minority or not as well, we have to find a way to work together. We should tackle one issue at a time. If that's bail reform, everybody jump in on bail reform. If that is, bringing down Rikers Island and turning it into a mental health institution, which it should be, then we all need to jump in at one time and do it. I think that in order for that to happen, we need to swallow our egos. And just because someone has a huge following doesn't make you a leader. I think that everyone, despite what their following is, should be in the same room, and everyone should pass the mic until we figure it out. Mr. Rogers again, right? We got to care about each other.
I hear you. So look, let's kind of, the key as to why we were here is to talk about all of these issues of prospective reform and how things look moving forward. When we hear these conversations about whether it's moving forward, defunding the police, or just outright overhauling law enforcement, in one respect, when we listen to the conversation that we've had this evening, if in fact, Adam, as you've put it, the history of U.S. policing is literally rooted in racism, rooted in slave codes, rooted in segregation, it is discussing an overhaul really that radical of an option. But to the extent that we have to be more practical, then, what does that look like? What does it look like in terms of law enforcement, police officers being held more accountable, particularly in the light of qualified immunity, right? Like when we start to think about all of just these buzzwords that are in the air and these concepts and issues that must be addressed if we were to ever actually get to a place of meaningful action, meaningful reform, I want us to kind of finish the conversation on that end before we open it up to the audience. Kirk, let me start with you. After all your years on the force, what do you think?
Sure. I'm still kind of lost on, should I smoke weed? Should I not smoke weed? I don't know. I've been thinking about it. But I'll work that out on my own. So
we're going to do another CLE and figure that out.
Right.
Please let me moderate them. Go ahead.
So, what's interesting is, let's talk about the culture that we live in at the moment. So if you return to your home and someone has broken into your home, you call 911. If you return to your home and your child hasn't come home from the mall and they've disobeyed you, you call 911. If you return to your home and you have a dispute with your neighbor, you call 911. If you return to your home and there's someone with a mental health crisis in front of your home, you call 911. We call 911 for everything in our society. And who shows up? Person in uniform with a firearm who is grossly undertrained to handle anything I mentioned except for that first one, right? The true, if you're truly a victim of a crime, and we could go further and talk about what is a crime and what is not a crime, or what should be a crime, right? So let's not even go there, but that's why I use that example. Putting a Band-Aid on a system, that Judge and Adam have so eloquently spoke about, that is just broken from its origins. And we need to reimagine policing. And that's not a reach. It's only a reach for those who can't imagine that their arms are long enough. It's not a reach. We have to reimagine our culture. So what should law enforcement look like? How do we correct this? Well, first of all, identify what policing is. And second, realize that it is an entity. There should be an entity in our communities. And that entity services the community in many different aspects. One aspect might be to redress harms that are done that we might classify as crimes. Another aspect is to redress disputes. Another aspect is to work with all type of social ills. Some of those folks would be in uniform, some would not. Some would be civilians, some would not. So it requires a reimagining. We need to get out of this mindset that we must call the police, and the police come and they're going to correct everything. And that's what I was told. I remember my father telling me that. If someone calls 911 and you show up, you can't just leave without the job done. And that was a tremendous amount of pressure. And I certainly did not have those skills. Second, what separates law enforcement officers from the lawyers in this room? Education. All the lawyers in this room have, at minimum, 4 years of undergraduate education and 3 years of law school. And many of you have much more. And for that, we call this the legal profession. And we need to understand that policing is a profession. And police officers should be trained. Their education should be akin to an undergraduate education at the very least. I always tell my criminal law students, my first year criminal law students, halfway through the semester, you now know more law than any police officer in this country will ever know. There's something wrong with that. So we don't train them, we don't educate them, and further, we don't take advantage of the resources involved in that particular education. In other words, all training in most departments, including New York City Police Department, is done by other police officers. We live in New York City. We have some of the greatest educational academic institutions in the world who would fight over each other to educate our police officers for free. And we don't take advantage of that. So reimagining what it is, how we deliver these services, what we even call them. Should we call them police services? Should we call them law enforcement services? And by the way, there should be prosecutors and defense attorneys in this entity in the community. Why wait until you spend the night in the tombs to find out you have to go home when it can be settled at the community level? So we need to imagine that and imagine how we educate our law enforcement officials. And we all know what happened to us when we, Adam and I were talking about this earlier, when we went to undergrad and we finished law school. Our sense of self, sense of community, and sense of the world changed greatly. So when I become master of the universe, that's the way our communities will operate and policing will operate.
Beautifully put, Kirk. And, I think just what you noted, I had never really thought about it, but just the importance of education, right? And it's almost like you wonder, would education and more of it be not congruous for those officers in terms of what the historical roots and purposes of policing was, right? Like the more that they know, the more that they have an understanding of sociology, the more that they have to think, maybe it would undercut those historical origins. I don't know. But just kind of thinking, and I want to start to kind of just get into some of the questions that I have received from the audience, because as we talk about eradicating the racial disparities, that's a lot of where these questions that I'm reading right now are going. So we can just organically thread it in. But I toss this up, whoever's going to catch it. What changes do you believe would be the most effective to change the system? So clearly, Kirk, we just talked about education. I don't know if somebody wants to jump on the issue of qualified immunity. Potluck for whomever wants to jump in, but which changes would be the most effective at this point?
The budget needs to shift. Look, I don't know where the term defund the police came from. I didn't necessarily agree with that. And that may be based biasly on my practice 1983 law. We need to spend more in the area of the education, what the professor just eloquently said. The budget needs to go towards resolving issues without pulling out your gun or putting handcuffs on people. And the thing about it is, it should always be the last resort to take someone in custody or pull out a gun. And that's not how officers are trained. And that's not how they feel either. And the only way you tackle that is by shifting the budget or adding more to their budget to incorporate more vacations, more therapists. There need to be some people who know. I wish I can dispatch Ayala and Dr. Phil to some people's projects as opposed to the police. But that's the type of investment that needs to happen. It's the police need a mechanism of relief. A lot of them are overworked. They come in these communities with an attitude, right? And they take it out on people that they aren't educated, and they don't understand that 98% of the people who are there are victims of crime themselves. They're not perpetrators of crimes. And so I think that the only way you can get people to treat people like people is by reminding people through therapy that these are people you're dealing with. And that comes from a resources thing. We saw a war on drugs that resulted in the maximum. I mean, look, Rikers Island is overfilling, just like many of the other jails and prisons in our society. So if we shifted all of that money to have a war on drugs that resulted in mass incarceration, I think that we should, in turn, shift that money into child care in those communities, real jobs in those communities, and the best educational systems in those communities. And you come talk to me in 20 years and you tell me what the results are. Because I know, being born in 1980, I watched them as my friends would go live with their grandmothers and grandfathers, and we would wonder why. And their grandmothers and grandfathers would say, oh, well, so-and-so went down south to live, or so-and-so in the service. Well, they were really locked up or strung out on drugs. And as a result, you fast forward right now. Who are the grandmothers right now in our communities of color? Who are the grandmothers and grandfathers in Bed-Stuy? They were the mothers and fathers of the people affected directly by and ravaged by the crack epidemic. And so when people want to act as if it didn't happen and don't clean up, you have swarms of kids without role models and fathers and uncles and stuff like that. And so they're running around and they're roaming the streets. And now the narrative gets revived, right? They're this, they're that, they're this, they're that. We need to direct the money to where it needs to go. People ask me all the time, am I Republican or Democrat? I'm a realocrat. And look, whoever it is, the communities that we are talking about always get the last end of the stick. Always.
I have a few.
Oh, absolutely, Judge Scheindlin.
I have a little checklist of the things I'd like to see that would make a difference. So, in the Floyd opinion, there was also remedies portion, and one of the remedies was body cameras being worn by police officers, and it sounded so good that they would be filmed. And I do think, as I said earlier, that filming these events has made an enormous difference, and we're seeing convictions now of officers that we never saw before. But what's happening with these body camera tapes is they're kind of being suppressed. They're there, but you can't get them. And lawyers have spent years trying to get them in cases. So we need transparency. If that tape is there, it should come out. We need to know what's going on in the streets because we need to get rid of bad apples because that's one big problem. So we need that. We need to take responsibility. And when I say the word responsibility, that's where qualified immunity comes in. I don't know if you all know this is a judicially made doctrine. And it protects the police officer by saying, well, if it wasn't clearly established by an exact case in the United States Supreme Court where the facts were almost the same, then we can't hold the police officer responsible. And they know it. And they also know that their pockets are not at risk because their police departments will cover. So there's no sense of personal responsibility. Many of them aren't even fired and are still working for the force. A lot of these folks have had a record of doing bad things repeatedly, and it's not released. It's not released. It's called unsubstantiated, or it's substantiated. And that has to change too, and it is changing in New York. You can get at some of these priors, but we're talking about the whole country here, not just New York. So there has to be transparency, there has to be responsibility. And there, of course, has to be real training, not just saying, oh, we're going to improve training. You got to really train how to de-escalate, not escalate, not immediately use the taser that ends up killing the kid. No excuse for it. You need to do de-escalation training. You need psychologists in every police department. That's what you need. And of course, you've already said money should be reallocated to mental health and away from other things. We got to get rid of these military weapons that are now used in police departments all over the country. Why do we need military weapons? So that's my wish list. I'm sure I could add 5 more, but I certainly want to raise all of those.
Can I add just one very quick thing? Thank you, Judge. And I just want everybody to look at the photos, the pictures, the portraits on the wall. And we're not going to change anything until those portraits change. With all due respect to the learned judges on the wall, that is not who we are. That's not I'm a lifelong resident of New York City. It's not the New York I grew up in. It's not New York now. And yet, the decision makers, those who write the decisions that we still live under, right? We still live under Terry v. Ohio, decided in 1968. Who drafted that decision? Right? And all the judges that were appointed in the last administration. So when this profession, our profession, is more reflective of the country we live in, and it's not until that time, I think, that we're actually going to see some change. So it's just a point that has to be made while we sit here. And like I said, all due respect to this institution and to those who have come before us. But this is 2023, last time I checked.
Really good question here. Touches into issues of some of the disparities we've seen over the years, but also just frankly, accountability. This is a great question. Historically, prosecutors have been hesitant to admit wrongdoing when faced with an exoneration. An example being the Central Park 5 lead prosecutor who still denies any wrongdoing versus the current Westchester County DAs who are voluntarily requesting to dismiss numerous convictions based on corrupt prosecutions from her predecessor's administration. So, when thinking about redemption, how important do you think it is for a prosecutor's office to actually admit wrongdoing?
Is for anyone?
Toss up.
So our firm, along with a couple other attorneys, actually represent about 10 of the 26 people who are going to be exonerated from Westchester. This was just announced, and it looked real pretty when you read it, right? But I can't begin to tell you how much money we've spent to try to uncover this, and it's still not fully uncovered. It's not 26 people at all, okay? It's not. And there's currently right now a Department of Justice investigation going on, and we're waiting on them to release their report because we are having trouble getting all of the information that we think should be readily available. And it's taken too long. A lot of these men are out, but they can't get CDLs, they can't get this, they can't get that, because these drug convictions were keeping and preventing them from doing that. I think this is what I believe. I believe that people are concerned about their careers and backlash. And I think that's what keeps them from doing what they know they should do right away. It's as if you're watching a blaze, but you're deciding what type of water you want to use to put it out. And I think that if we as a society would make it more comfortable for DAs to do this, then they would do it. Have you ever heard a DA run and say, vote for me? Because if somebody wrongfully convicted, I'm gonna get them out and I'm gonna prosecute the police. You've never heard that. They've always said, you vote for me, I lock them up, I throw away the key, because we're gonna be safer that way.
Actually, when we heard that, he got recalled.
Yeah.
Chesa Boudin.
That is true. That is true. That is true. He is one, but it goes to show you, there aren't many Larry Krasners. There aren't many the late great Ken from Brooklyn. I mean, it just
Ken Thompson.
Ken Thompson. I mean, and I called him Ken because when I first got to New York, Ken Thompson was one of the first people to embrace me. He knew my story, background. I was finishing up with Judge Deborah Batts, and he was introducing me to introduced me to New York. So I remember him, and like I said, I think that it takes courage. I think that it takes not being afraid, and I think it takes us as a society to support people who make these courageous acts to do what they're supposed to do. People are afraid of lawsuits. Right now, we are litigating cases where cities and county governments have spent to the tune of $400,000 to $600,000 defending officers with records that Judge just mentioned, bad records, but they don't care because it's not about them particularly. It's about the money aspect. So just think of that. Taxpayer dollars being spent to defend people who are violating the rights of those same taxpayers.
And then the settlements, the fortune that is spent on the settlements is not the best use of our dollars. If we didn't have the problem in the first place, we'd have the money for good things like housing, which we need desperately.
Can I add just one or 2 points? I think it's the prosecutors sort of unwilling to recognize their mistakes is part of a broader cultural issue and doctrinal issue where we have a system that privileges finality over fairness. I think a lot of people who haven't represented clients, particularly in the criminal courts, don't realize that so many of the cases are not decided on the merits, that there are procedural impediments and barriers to justice. And I think sort of a secondary point is that I think we need to expand the definition of what constitutes a wrongful conviction. A wrongful conviction, and I think it should be one that conviction integrity units are guided by, is when there is a constitutional violation that undermines the reliability or the integrity of a conviction, right? And I think when we sort of incorporate that way of thinking and when we finally privilege fairness over finality, we'll be better positioned than we are now.
100% agree. There are a lot of people who've pled guilty and they were not. I 100% agree.
Judge Scheindlin, you just quickly touched upon something, but in practice as a civil rights litigator myself, the settlements. It's almost as if the city just looks at so many of these constitutional egregious wrongdoings as just a part of doing business, right? It's almost like it's a secret part of the budget, especially during that whole stop and frisk era that led directly into your courtroom. But that may be a whole other conversation, but just in terms of, it's just crazy to me that taxpayer dollars, mine, are paying for these egregious constitutional acts against people who look like me, right? Why am I paying for this, right? Why is the city paying for this? Why don't we have a mechanism by which officers are held more accountable in terms of percentages coming out of their check, or insurance, in some ways like policing the police with respect to higher premiums, right? Like it's just, at the end of the day, when we talk about where we can go, I think from a practical standpoint, the options are limitless. But it's just really, do we want to do that moving forward? And I say all of that to thread into these last 3 questions that basically amount to one. So 3 of you were basically all thinking the same thing. And so I'm just going to read the questions and you'll see how it just turns into one. It seems as though things are going backwards from the promises made after Floyd. I mean, what is the state of reforms in New York State? Has anything actually changed? Is there any hope it will change? Because yesterday, this is the next question, the CCRB announced it may need to close the racial profile investigations unit on July 1st. What can we do in the face of an administration that seems to be running away from recent progress? And then another note that the new stop and frisk that's occurring is basically occurring via the VTL stops with new backseat seatbelt law that the TLC codified in 2020, which the NYPD has been using as a way of essentially having contact with passengers that's leading to illegal stops and frisk, right? So I think there is this concern collectively in the audience. We talked about it at the beginning. Again, is George Floyd just one of those moments that for that moment we were outraged, but 20 years from now, it's just something that happened, right? If we're already starting to see rollbacks.
This is a really hard question, and I'm going to just turn to two of branches of government. It was alluded to, the George Floyd Act. Congress, as you know, is ineffective. Congress in this country doesn't act, can't get guns off the street. It also can't pass the legislation that needs to be passed that would stop some of this. There are suggestions or laws in that George Floyd Act that would really make a difference. But the way our Congress is now, minoritarian Congress, I might add, you know how Congress is set up, where there's no people in one state and they get the same number of senators that in states that have 38 million people. Well, that's it. That's called minoritarian government. So we have no help. And let's talk about the federal courts. They're a disaster. It's the United States Supreme Court's decision in the qualified immunity area that make you just choke. There was a famous case in 1983 where they knew that a police department had systematically for years withheld Brady material. And Rosario, same in New York, it's called Rosario, but Brady material, which means they didn't turn over exculpatory material and impeachment material for years, and people were convicted. And when it was found out, they still said, yeah, well, despite it's been a pattern, qualified immunity, and they sustained the conviction of people who never got their procedural due process. So with two dysfunctional branches of government, and I'm sorry to say federal courts, at least at the highest level, I don't have a lot of respect right now for the United States Supreme Court, as you can tell. So the Supreme Court and the legislative branch are useless. What we have to do is hope for the state courts to pick up where the federal courts once acted. And that's where the action is going to be. So I just want to say,
Oh, you're absolutely right, Judge Scheindlin. You see it right now in these state court races across the country. Everybody can see what you're seeing. Money is being poured in to the fact that the states are going to be the new battlegrounds.
On the abortion issue, we did so well in Wisconsin recently that the whole Supreme Court changed, and it's going to flow over to criminal justice. So state courts are really important.
If I may, I think I wholeheartedly agree, but I think also the rise in crime statistics drives this rollback a lot. Most politicians would sell their soul to reduce crime at any expense. And why? Because the public complains. And this is nothing new. You could trace this throughout history. You know, think of the rights that we freely and willingly gave up because of the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war against the Japanese, right? So this is something that goes on consistently. And we were making a little bit of progress, and then you have these spikes in crime. And as we have spoken about throughout the course of this evening, who commits crimes in the mind of the public? People of color commit crimes. And therefore, what are folks more concerned with? Are they concerned with police reform? Or are they concerned with dropping crime? And I think when you see a spike in the crime, you see, given the FBI stats, and we can talk forever about whether those stats are accurate and so forth, but when you see the spike in crime, there is a direct inverse correlation with concern for the individual rights of people of color with regards to police brutality and police misconduct. So I do think a lot of this is also driven by crime. And, how can we combat that? By being aware. I mean, literally by being aware and not going for the head fake when somebody is standing at the podium. We need, X amount of police officers here or there to keep you safe, right? That's not always the purpose, right? And that's perhaps not always the way to achieve that particular purpose.
So then, Adam, I'm just going to leave it with you, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Jade.
believe.
But let me just kind of leave it with you here because you talked so much about, again, the origins of policing very well, again, I might add. And then listening to these questions about, like, here we are, it seems that in lieu of progressing beyond 2020, we're just going back toward a lot of the origins of why policing came about in the first place. From a policy standpoint, what should we be doing moving forward, and where do you see us going? And I'll leave the end of the conversation with you.
Wow, okay. I think I'm very concerned that there's going to be another panel like this in 2049, and someone's going to sit up there and say there's a two-tiered system of justice in New York State. And I think we need a complete paradigm shift. But I also realize that's not going to happen overnight. And so for sort of basic harm reduction principles, and I really wish Mr. Bragg was here for this, I think it is essential to not roll back hard-won reforms. I'm, of course, talking about bail and discovery, and it is important to follow the data rather than the daily news and the New York Post headlines. I think there is a real world where we could actually eliminate jail for misdemeanor offenses, and I actually think that is consistent with public safety, because when you lock people up for misdemeanors, you're disrupting their lives in an even more significant way that is going to be not only harmful to them, but harmful to the public. And I think, the sort of one point I want to make, and I talked about it with Mr. Murray so often, is eliminating the prosecutorial use of peremptory strikes. And there are actually a couple prosecutors now in the country that are starting to do so. As Justice Marshall, the founder of LDF, said in his prescient concurrence in Batson, the framework there does little to mitigate racial discrimination in the jury selection process. And it's not only implicating the rights of the accused, but it's implicating the rights of the prospective jurors themselves, who are the constituents of the prosecutors. And so I think those are some very basic things we could do to make the system a little bit more equitable and more fair. But I think ultimately we'll need to address the social conditions that lead to crime, which is housing, which is healthcare, and which is all the things that the panelists so expertly talked about tonight.
You can't drop your mic, but you can turn it off. And I guess I will give the floor back. I appreciate all of the discussion that we've had this evening. And although 20 years from now, I don't want to be having the same conversation, I'm glad that we did have it tonight. So thank you to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. We want to thank everyone for joining us tonight as we conclude this part of the event. We really hope that this discussion really gave you an overview of the work that lies ahead of us, but we also hope that it really galvanizes the people, the members of this audience, to really champion and advocate for initiatives, policies, legislation that champions us moving our criminal legal system towards one that is more just, as Adam said, more equitable and more accountable. If you would like to join the Minorities in the Profession Committee, you can do so by applying on the City Bar website. We want to thank our moderator, Phil. Thank you so much. Our panelists, of course. All of our co-sponsors, and of course the City Bar for making this event possible. In particular, we'd love to thank Martha Harris, Linda Kimball, and of course Tanya Martinez Galanucci, and all of the people that were behind the scenes and making this event come to fruition. At this time, we invite you all to make your way across the hall to the reception area where we can continue this discussion and have refreshments. But thank you all and have a great night.